The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So we said, okay, we're not going to repeat the failed patterns of previous efforts, and instead we're going to test a thesis. We're going to test the thesis that Kim Jong-un might be able to be convinced that he's safer without the weapons than he is with the weapons. We also thought it was very important to make some assumptions about why he wants weapons in the first place. I think because of mirror imaging, many assume, well, he wants them for defensive purposes, to deter aggression against the North. But we're not convinced of that. First of all, every act of aggression, on the peninsula since June of 1950, when North Korea invaded, has been initiated by the North. And of course, the North Korean regime has a significant conventional deterrent capability with all the artillery and missiles that are in the range of Seoul. And so I think that we ought to at least entertain the notion that he wants the weapons for the reason the Kim family regime has stated, across all three generations of their dictatorships.
Welcome to The Mission Persists, National Security, a virtual conversation with General H.R. McMaster. The Mission Persists 2020 is a special year-end event series, or a year-end special event series of World Boston. What is this mission? Somebody asked me. So the mission of World Boston is to foster international engagement and global cooperation. You may have noticed that a lot has changed this year. And as the year has gone by, as the months have moved along in this pandemic time, we find that our programs have changed dramatically, but our mission really has stayed the same. So we decided to really look at this mission of international engagement at the end of the year with a series of special events. This is our second. We're delighted that General McMaster can be with us. We hope that you appreciate these special events and that you appreciate all of the work of World Boston throughout the year and the community that you're part of. We really thank our sponsors. We cannot possibly do this work as an independent, I want to stress independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. So thank you to all of the World Boston Mission Persists sponsors. Okay, so we are here tonight to have a conversation with General H.R. McMaster and in part to discuss his best-selling book, Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World. I will hand it over shortly to our interviewer, which tonight is not I. It is our excellent chair of the World Boston Board of Directors, Jeff Simrot. But first, we will go to, and then we'll have questions after the interview, I should say. But first, we will go to a little introductory piece by one of our board members, Jared Guthrie, who actually knows General McMaster quite well. So let's listen to that.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the next installment in World Boston's 2020 series entitled The Mission Persists, which focuses on continued international engagement. My name is Jared Guthrie, a member of the Board of Directors for World Boston and managing partner for Commonwealth Frontier Advisors, a firm which is focused on international opportunities in frontier and emerging markets. It gives me great pleasure to introduce today's guest and a man who understands a good deal about missions, General H.R. McMaster. H.R. McMaster is the Fuad and Michelle Ajami Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, the Bernard and Susan Liatow Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institution and lecturer at Stanford University School of Business. He was the 26th Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and also served as an active duty officer in the United States Army for 34 years after graduation from the United States Military Academy and achieving the rank of Lieutenant General. He holds a PhD in history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and he's the author of Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World, as well as the award-winning Dereliction of Duty, Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Lies that Led to Vietnam. I would like to take a moment to also share that I had the distinct honor to serve as an officer and fellow West Pointer in combat under General McMaster's command. Even in Iraq, he made a special effort to provide professional reading for his officers, so it's hardly surprising he's also had a successful career as an accomplished author. We welcome General McMaster and look forward to his insights on foreign policy and strategy. Brave rifles, sir. I'll now turn it over to Jeffrey Simrot, Chair of World Boston and moderator for today's series. Over to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Jared. Good afternoon, General. And thank you for joining us in this second segment of World Boston's fall series, The Mission Persists, 2020. My name is Jeffrey Simrot, and I chair World Boston's Board of Directors. On behalf of World Boston, a World Affairs Council, we extend our thanks and appreciation to you for joining us tonight. Our active and well-informed community should find the next hour or so quite informative. Before we begin, however, I want to plug your book, Battlegrounds. Here I'm showing a copy of the cover. Battlegrounds captures General McMaster's firsthand experiences in Kuwait, Iraq, Afghanistan, and as National Security Advisor to President Trump. These extraordinary experiences figure in the book's carefully assembled recommendations for post-Cold War national security strategies in 5 hotspots around the world: Russia, China, Afghanistan, Iran, and North Korea. In each instance, the book offers a proactive strategy or strategies for achieving strategic and national security goals. And so I can summarize. First, buy the book. Second, read it. Okay. And so can we begin, General?
Yes. Hey, Jeffrey, thanks to you. Thanks to Mary, Elise, the whole team. And it was great to see Jared at the outset. He led with great distinction in a very important mission in northwestern Iraq. So great to be with all of you. And thanks to everyone who's joined us.
Good. All right, let's start with the book's full title, which is Battlegrounds: The Fight to Defend the Free World. Please tell us why you chose this title, since I assume you chose it.
Yeah, Jeff, the reason is because we have to, I think, understand better important challenges to our future, important challenges to our security, our prosperity, and our way of life. And by understanding those challenges, we take the first step, obviously, in understanding what we have to do together across the free world to advance and protect our interests. I think that it's fair to say that since the end of the Cold War, we have not competed effectively. I write about really a dissipation of our strategic competence in the post-Cold War period, associated in large measure with a degree of over-optimism. I mean, we had reasons to be optimistic in the early 1990s, as you recall. We had won the Cold War. We had a lopsided victory over Saddam's army, the 4th largest army in the world, in Desert Storm. But I believe in the 90s, we bought into some assumptions that limited our ability to compete effectively to advance and protect our interests. And foremost among those is the assumption that the post-Cold War period was a period in which the primacy of our free and open societies over closed authoritarian systems had been guaranteed by kind of an arc of history. A related assumption, the great power competition, was a relic of the past. And then in the wake of that, the lopsided military victory in Desert Storm, an assumption that our technological military prowess had guaranteed really the primacy and of our military forces and our security going into the future. And I think this was all a setup. It was a setup for strategic shocks and disappointments in the 2000s. Obviously, the mass murder attacks on our country on September 11th, 2001, the unanticipated length and difficulty of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, we often debate, should we have invaded Iraq in 2003? I think we also ought to debate who the heck thought it would be easy? Why did they think it would be easy? And then of course, the financial crisis contributed to, I think, a loss of confidence, a shaking of our confidence that really shifted the emotional impetus behind policy, our foreign policy, from over optimism to pessimism and resignation. And I think while it's fair to say that the George W. Bush administration may have undervalued the risks and costs of action, such as the invasion of Iraq, that the Obama administration undervalued the risks and costs of inaction or disengagement in connection with the complete disengagement from Iraq in December of 2011, or the unenforced red line in Syria, or the decision not to try to shape the political outcome of the bombs not boots approach to removing, helping the Libyan people remove Gaddafi from power. So the book is an argument, Jeff, that is, I think, very consistent with the mission of World Boston, which is to reject what I describe in the book as strategic narcissism, the
Right.
tendency to define the world only in relation to us, and assume that what we do or choose not to do will be decisive to the outcome, and then to inoculate ourselves through strategic empathy. And this is in particular to view these challenges that we face from the perspective of others, and to pay particular attention to the ideology, emotions, aspirations that drive and constrain others, particularly rivals and adversaries and enemies.
And General, we have a slide for that. Our first slide, which takes from your book the definition, a brief definition of strategic narcissism, and I hope we can put that up. And then I added, these are my words, they're not yours, strategic narcissists lack strategic empathy, which I think was very well put, two concepts. So I wonder if you can apply strategic narcissism to two policies that you highlight in the book: South Korea's bilateral policy with North Korea, known as the Sunshine Policy, and the Obama administration's strategic patience policy.
Well, what both these approaches, the Sunshine Policy really being this idea that opening up to North Korea will fundamentally shift, the nature of the North Korean regime, and it will recognize the benefiting of, and therefore remove the North Korean regime's fundamental hostility. And then the idea of strategic patience, what the assumption there was that North Korea is just kind of an impossible state, right? If we're just patient, the Kim family regime, the only hereditary communist dictatorship in the world, will collapse before it becomes a threat to the world. And
Right.
I think what both of these approaches to North Korea lacked was strategic empathy, and in fact, and in particular, understanding the ideology that drives that regime, and the mechanisms of control that the Kim family have put in place, that are physical, associated with this gulag state, and the various methods of surveilling their own population, informing on anyone who might have the temerity to criticize or do anything but adulate, the regime, and then also the psychological control over the people, which has been multi-generational form of sustained propaganda, a form of brainwashing, really, in which the Kim family regime has made self-reliance, this Juche ideology, but really the deprivation associated with the North Koreans' isolation as a virtue, to make it as a sign of their virtuous nature. And
Right.
it has taken on actually the qualities of sort of an ideology of racial, or at least cultural, purity, right? And so I think whenever we neglect really these emotions and ideologies that drive and constrain the other, we tend to mirror image, right? And we tend to fall into traps, cognitive traps associated with optimism bias or confirmation bias. And I think that's been the case with the approach to North Korea, over many years.
Slide 2, again, from your book, summarizes the results, I think, of our policy in North Korea, the sort of the consequence of strategic narcissism.
Right. And I, associated with strategic narcissism is a failure to learn even from our most recent history. So I guess it's predictable that a historian would make the argument for studying history, right? But I think that we have to understand how the recent past produced the present as the first step for making projections into the future. And I think the study of history, can be an exercise in humility, because the time outlines disappear, recognize the human dimension of experiences and developments and events and the complex causality of events and the role the contingency plays. And so I think that the book is in large measure an argument for strategic empathy and empathy through the study of history.
Yes, yes. So you spend some time in the book discussing the counter strategy that you and Matt Pottinger, who at the time was, I believe, the NSC's senior director for Asia, sought to implement for North Korea. And I want to spend some time on this, General, because I think it was, the way you laid it out, it was a fascinating account of how foreign policy gets done. A first-person account, and I was very impressed with it. So, tell us about your counter strategy with Matt Pottinger.
Well, what we did is we examined the previous failed efforts to achieve denuclearization in the North, and we were determined to avoid the definition of insanity often attributed to Einstein, which maybe falsely, that insanity, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So we said, okay, we're not going to repeat the failed patterns of previous efforts, and instead, we're going to test a thesis. We're going to test the thesis that Kim Jong-un might be able to be convinced that he's safer without the weapons than he is with the weapons. We also thought it was very important to make some assumptions about why he wants weapons in the first place. I think because of mirror imaging, many assume, well, he wants them for defensive purposes, to deter aggression against the North. But we're not convinced of that. First of all, every act of aggression, on the peninsula since June of 1950, when North Korea invaded, has been initiated by the North. And of course, the North Korean regime has a significant conventional deterrent capability with all the artillery and missiles that are in the range of Seoul. And so I think that we ought to at least entertain the notion that he wants the weapons for the reason the Kim family regime has stated, across all three generations of their dictatorships, and that is that they want to unify the peninsula under the red banner. I believe that nuclear weapons in the hands of North Korea would allow North Korea to extort us, to try to extort the U.S. off the peninsula as the first step in forced reunification. I do think they also may want nuclear weapons to threaten and extort countries in the region, Japan in particular. And of course, this is particularly dangerous, right? Because North Korea, in possession of nuclear weapons, would probably impel a breakdown in the non-proliferation regime across Asia potentially, but certainly in Northeast Asia. And also, North Korea's never met a weapon it didn't try to sell to somebody, right? Including its nuclear weapons program to Syria until the Israeli Defense Force bombed that facility in 2007. So, I think it's really important for us to examine what's potentially motivating the adversary as the first step in crafting a strategy. So we decided, okay, well, what do we have to do? Well, to convince Kim that he's safer without them, we have to test out our ability to apply maximum pressure to the regime.
Yes.
Ambassador Nikki Haley got unprecedented UN Security Council sanctions in place. So we strove to get those enforced. They're still not fully enforced. and to get others to play a more productive role, China in particular. I tell the story in the book about how we have a North Korea strategy, but China has a U.S. strategy, right? So China has not been a cooperative partner in this.
I plan to ask you because I think we're talking in terms of contingencies. China is a key contingency here, and perhaps you can talk about China's strategy and how it affects ours on the Korean Peninsula.
Right. Well, China is driven under Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party to extend and tighten its exclusive grip on power internally, to make China whole, which is why we see the extension of the party's repression to Hong Kong. This is why we also see a campaign of cultural genocide ongoing in Xinjiang. It's also why you see the threats toward Taiwan. Taiwan is seen as a threat to the Chinese Communist Party because it gives the lie to the idea that the Chinese people are culturally predisposed toward not wanting a say in how they're governed. Taiwan is a successful democracy, obviously, but China's efforts to extend and tighten its grip on power internally is related to this strategy, or this aspiration of national rejuvenation, of taking center stage in the world. And the first step, I think, in China in doing that is to try to create exclusionary areas of primacy across the Indo-Pacific region. To do so by pushing the United States out of the region, and the party views North Korea as a way that could, as a way to do that, as a way to help the party push us off the peninsula, as a first step in isolating its main regional rival, Japan, and then to use its coercive power associated with probably the largest, I think the largest peacetime military buildup in history, an increase of their defense spending by 800% since the mid 1990s, but also the coercive economic power and the effort to set debt traps for countries in the region, to create servile economic relationships with countries in the region, and to really recreate a kind of a new form of the tributary system of old Chinese empires, right? So I think that's how North Korea fits in to an overall approach across the Indo-Pacific, and it's important to recognize that. So there are going to be real limitations on the degree to which we can rely on China. That's right. To assist us in the campaign of maximum pressure. There are other options available. I mean, I think secondary sanctions on Chinese financial institutions that are facilitating the bypassing of UN Security Council resolutions is a potential option, for example.
We'll get to that. We'll absolutely get to that. There is a third partner in your strategic thinking about North Korea, and that's Japan. In March of 2018, you wrote, you hosted the South Korean Ambassador Chung, and your counterpart in Japan, Shotaro, in San Francisco. And I think I would describe it, and I'm going to ask to show it on slide 3, that you arrived at several mutually reinforcing actions the United States, Korea, and Japan could decide upon, including the maximum pressure campaign that you described. Now, before I ask you to review these mutually reinforcing actions, I think it would be helpful to talk about the tensions in the bilateral relationship between South Korea and Japan, because not only is China what I think we can call a contingency, relationships with South Korea and Japan going back to World War II, even before World War II, are also a contingency. So can you describe those relationships for us?
Right. So of course, after World War II, I think we started what became known as like the miracle in our relationship with Japan, a country that that obviously we fought a costly war with, a war that ended with the dropping of 2 atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a war that was initiated by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. But Japan has became an important ally just a few years, after we fought this devastating and costly war. But of course, with the relationship with South Korea was one that was initiated really in 1945 as part of the end of World War II, and U.S. forces occupying South Korea were there to prevent Russia from taking over, the Soviet Union from taking over the whole peninsula. We withdrew forces from South Korea just a few months before North Korea invaded, and there was definitely a correlation there. But when we formed the alliance system for Northeast Asia, we did it with the San Francisco Treaty, and it was essentially a U.S. bilateral relationships that it went beyond Northeast Asia, but bilateral relationships. But the U.S., because it was kind of the hub, would help kind of keep the family together. And of course, that was a tall order, for South Korea and Japan because of Japan's brutal occupation of South Korea for decades. So the difficulties in the relationship are mainly associated with historical animosity. They're also associated with maybe the philosophies and of the various political parties that were in power. The President Moon's party in South Korea is a left-leaning party. This is a party that emerged from the Gwangju uprising. That it is a party that has a strong streak of animosity for Japan, historical animosity for Japan. Is very demanding in connection with the reparations from Japanese corporations, for example, and the issue of comfort women. And then you also had the LDP in Japan, which interacted with them in sort of a toxic way, because the LDP is a nationalist party under President Abe. It's a party that was not abashed, and his father wasn't either. President Abe's father was not reticent about honoring Japanese war dead, and in doing so, of course, that rankled South Koreans more. So there are a number of issues that tend to inflame the tensions. What I wanted to do was to help both Japan and South Korea look toward the future, and to use the examples of our bilateral relationships as a way that they can get over their own animosity, and in particular, the way in which the United States and Japan have become so close, as a way to show South Korea that we can transcend these historical animosities, South Korea and Japan both. So I met what might appear to be a strange venue, which is the Marine Corps Memorial, which is it's a living memorial. It's a hotel in San Francisco, and as you might imagine, it has all the artifacts of the Pacific War there, and it was, I think it was a strong message to deliver. That we can. It also has artifacts from the Korean War as well. And I think it worked, for as long as we kept this up, Jeff. This is the third of 3 confidential meetings I held with my counterparts. It was important for us to come to a common understanding of the problem and to kind of take this pledge together that you showed on the slide, that, hey, these are the principles that will guide us going forward. And whenever we had points of contention, we could say, hey, well, we agreed to these principles based on our diagnosis of the challenge. How does this argument that we're having relate to the principles? We could typically resolve them that way. And I do think after I left, maybe we took our eye off that relationship a bit. And as you know, it's deteriorated significantly. I think with Suga-san, the new prime minister coming in to replace Prime Minister Abe, he's already made an overture toward President Moon, wants to visit South Korea. I think that's all super positive. And I think it's going to get better. Hopefully we've hit rock bottom in terms of South Korea-Japan relationships, because I'll just say quickly, another reason why this is important is we want to convince China to do more to resolve this, right? And if China sees every provocation from North Korea as driving us closer together, they might realize, hey, well, this is cutting against this being a nuclear on North Korea is cutting against my objective of getting the United States out of Northeast Asia. It's actually drawn the United States in closer, and it's drawing South Korea and Japan closer together. So that was my hope anyway. I hope we can get back to it.
Yes, yes, and I'll come to that as well. Getting back to it. Okay, so the maximum pressure campaign that ensued after I call it a trilateral discussion on North Korea, produced two summits between President Trump and Kim Jong-un. However, you left the administration, I believe, in April of 2018, prior to the first of those summits in June. So in slide 4, and we don't have to go through it, but in slide 4, this is my version of the Korean Playbook that you left behind. I mean, I think there are 6 or 7 aspects to it. Now, the question is, what has happened since? Has any of this playbook been implemented? You may want to take a second to look at it.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, I think it has, but as often occurs, Jeff, strategies are always implemented imperfectly. I do think we've never put the pressure on North Korea that we've had the potential to put on, based in part, as I mentioned, circumvention of sanctions by China, and to a lesser extent Russia, because they just have a lesser percentage of trade. Over about 95% of North Korea's trade is with China, right?
It's with China, yes.
On
yes.
China. And so they have tremendous coercive economic power over North Korea. And we haven't done all of this, right? We haven't done secondary sanctions. We haven't done interdiction of smuggling. I think that under Article 2 of our Constitution, we would probably have authority to do that. It'd be great to do it in a multinational format. I think Japan would sign up. We could maybe coax South Korea to participate, and then invite the Chinese to participate and see what they say. And then I think that we also have not taken other actions that you mentioned on the slide there, maybe as in such a focused way. So I think that there is an opportunity to continue to test this thesis. I think it's worth doing. I think because the alternatives are unpalatable. A nuclear armed North Korea is a danger to the whole world.
Yes.
And then I also don't think accepting them as a nuclear power and deterring them is viable. And certainly we don't want a war, right? So let's test out this thesis of maximum pressure and see what can be accomplished. I think the regime might be vulnerable to this at this stage, because we don't know what's happened in North Korea in connection with the various problems of 2020 for them. Of course, COVID-19. If you believe them, there has not even been one case of COVID-19 in North Korea. And of course,
I don't believe it.
It's unbelievable. And then they've been ravaged by floods, and there have been reports of binge buying in Pyongyang among the elites there. Kim Jong-un has disappeared, from public view. Now he's absent again, but two previous periods of 3 weeks each this year. What's going on there? Nobody really knows for sure. So I think that, I think that the time is right to keep the maximum pressure on. I hope that Biden administration doesn't fall for the normal cycle. I think you could, if you're going to place a bet on it, I would bet that North Korea will engage in a major provocation just before or just after President-elect Biden is sworn in on January 20th. And what they'll want to get is, if you go back to that one, on that one slide that you showed, they'll want to get back to that same cycle. And I don't think we should fall for it. I think that maximum pressure should be an element of continuity between administrations.
Okay. And reading the book, I felt that I wanted to hear more about the State Department's contributions to the various playbooks. Can you describe the State Department's contribution to the North Korean playbook, which I've concentrated on?
Yeah. Yeah, I think the State Department did a really great job on the campaign of maximum pressure initially. And what they did is, when we came up with the North Korea strategy, they did what you expect. They sent out a cable, right, to all of our diplomats, our chiefs of mission, and said, please do your part. And our diplomats did a fantastic job of going to leaders of various countries to increase the maximum pressure campaign. North Korea runs a full range of illicit activities to get access to the hard currency, which it then uses for its nuclear and missile programs. It doesn't use it to help its own people, for sure. And this is like, they run hotels out of their embassies and consulates to make money, gambling operations, a whole range of cyber criminal activity, a lot of illicit trafficking, arms sales. They'll sell arms to anyone. And then, of course, what they do is they export essentially slave labor, right, or indentured servants, who have to
China,
send all of their money back,
Yes.
to China, to Russia, to Egypt, to Qatar, right? I mean, there to lots of places, right? I mean, the World Cup soccer stadiums were built in part by North Korean laborers, right? So, but we got them sent home, and not from Russia or from China, sadly, even though that was one of the key UN Security Council resolutions that Ambassador Haley, got passed. She did a brilliant job on this as well. So if you include her efforts and the diplomatic efforts, she did a brilliant job at US UN headquarters as well.
Okay.
And then also what we asked is we asked our ambassadors to convene the ambassadors from like-minded countries at their residences to explain to them what our efforts were, and to enlist their assistance in going to the host government to get them to implement, for example, to enforce the sanctions, for example. So I think the State Department did a great job. I do think what they did, I disagreed with, is they rushed to talk to North Korea. Part of the strategy was, okay, let's let this roll for a while, this campaign of maximum pressure. But it's like the Geico commercial, right? When you're the State Department, you negotiate. Like, it's what you do, and so they can't help themselves. And so I think they did send mixed messages to North Korea with Secretary Tillerson. I think he came from an oil background. He announced these back channels, and I want to say, he was Secretary. If you announce the back channel, it's not a back channel anymore, right? So I think this is what preempt or provoked, the Trump tweet of, "Hey Rex, you're wasting your time." Do you remember that one? When he said he was trying to talk to North Korea? So there's always friction in policy implementation, for sure. But I think overall, the State Department did a great job on the strategy.
My friends, this is Mary, just giving us a little time check, because we do want to get to audience Q&A in about 5 minutes or so.
Thanks, Mary. I wanted to turn to Russia while we have time. Russia's playbook includes disinformation and propaganda to sow division and disruption in the West. It also includes military aggression, assassination, and economic coercion. Now, how does the concept of strategic empathy inform your view about what motivates the Russians? They're not merely mischievous, in my view. They are destructive, and they are intentionally destructive. Question is why?
Well, the reason is, I mean, you have to really look at what drives and constrains Vladimir Putin, because he is in charge. I mean, he is in charge more than any leader of the Soviet Union was in charge, right? At least they had a Politburo they had to answer to. He really doesn't have anybody to answer to. He's at the top of this kind of protection network that he runs. But so, without getting diverted, to answer your question directly, he is driven by a sense of honor lost after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the drive to restore Russia to national greatness. He's a KGB operator, so he's cognizant of the fact that he can't compete with us being the United States, the West, Europe in particular, on our own terms, right? His economy is the size of Texas's economy or Italy's economy. And so his theory of victory is to drag us all down such that he'll be the last man standing. And to do that with a sustained campaign of disruption, disinformation, and denial is how I describe it in the book. And essentially what he wants to do with this, especially with the cyber-enabled information warfare against us, is to divide us, to polarize us, to pit us against each other, to reduce our confidence in our common identity as Americans, our common identity as Europeans, our common identity in terms of the transatlantic relationship between our democracies, and to reduce our confidence in our democratic principles and institutions and processes. And so that, he doesn't create the divisions in our society, but he does his best to widen those divisions.
Yes.
And he's been successful. He's been successful because our political leaders, President Trump among them, but really across both political parties, have compromised our principles to score partisan political points. He's been able to widen divisions among us on associated with race and on policy issues like immigration and gun control. And he's been able to do it much more effectively. This is not a new approach, right? I mean, the Soviet Union initiated programs like this in the 1920s, oriented on America, using many of the same themes. Again, prioritizing even then issues of racial division, associated with racial divisions. And the reason I think he's much more successful now is he has much more effective media and much more an information environment that's conducive to this campaign of disinformation. And we can talk more about that if you want, Jeff. But I mean, I think we have to be certainly aware of it, pull the curtain back on it, and inoculate ourselves against it.
I did want to try and squeeze in one last question, which runs from Putin. Weakening Europe, you write, is the priority in Putin's effort to break apart the post-Cold War order and reestablish Russia as a great power. And we've heard you credit Putin with some success here. But at the same time, you refer to disunity between the United States and Europe. What, in your view, explains post-Cold War disunity between the United States and Europe? How would you go about repairing it? I know that's a broad question. And do you consider it worth repairing?
Well, I think a lot of this has to be taken on by the Europeans themselves, right? So, of course, everybody wants to really talk about how Donald Trump is an offensive person who's like wrecked the transatlantic relationship. But I think we have to recognize that, hey, Europe's problems didn't begin with Donald Trump, right? They predated Donald Trump, and they have a lot to do with European skepticism about surrendering countries' sovereignty to kind of faceless bureaucrats, as someone described them in Brussels, right? You saw this really in connection with the Brexit campaign, but also you've seen it with the rise of kind of nationalist parties, across Europe. It's been exacerbated by the refugee crisis, and these nativist parties and nationalist parties have gained momentum and are interacting with left parties in a way that is having a divisive effect, I think, analogous to what we're seeing in the United States to a certain extent these days. And so Russia uses disinformation and the co-option of certain elites, support for extremist groups within Europe, to create this kind of crisis, and then to take advantage of it by sowing division, breaking apart the EU, which is what he would like to see, breaking apart NATO, and then rending the transatlantic relationship. So I think that's step one. Hey, Europe, get your own act together. I think they will move in this direction. I do believe that the danger of the collapse of the European idea and experiment has focused the minds in Europe, and there's been kind of a recalibration of what to expect and what is maybe too much to expect from the European Union. I think that the financial actions taken across the European Union to cope with the recession there have been positive, such that member states see the benefit of the union, and that'll be a positive development. And I also think that Russia's continued subversion, as well as China's like wolf warrior diplomacy after foisting COVID-19 on the world, and the Navalny poisoning going to go back to Russia. I mean, I think this is really beginning to have a galvanizing effect on Europe, right? You saw this with with really the recognition of China as a systemic competitor, for example. I think the relationship is going to get much better. But I think we have to ask the question of the relationship for what purpose, to what end, and of course, the mood music will be better, right, under a Biden administration for sure. But what does that get us, right? It should get us, I think, more defense burden sharing. It should get us, the United States, a higher degree of cooperation in competing with China in critical emerging arenas of competition associated with data standards and internet privacy standards and communications infrastructure. And we could go with technological development and application. So I think that there is a tremendous opportunity to not to just go back, to turn the clock back. That won't work, but to create kind of a new mechanisms and venues for cooperation, like this idea of a T10, right? The like 10 like-minded countries who will lead in the development of technology and the application of technology to the emerging data-driven global economy and to defense. So I think there's a real opportunity. I think it'll be at the top of a Biden administration agenda. It's worth getting behind and supporting for sure.
Good.
Okay.
Well, I just wanted to thank the general. I mean, I very much enjoyed talking with you.
Yeah, I enjoyed it too, Jeff. And thanks so much for your attention to the book. Great questions and great summaries. Thank you.
Great slides. But you're not off the hook yet. We have many questions from people in our large audience, almost 200. We're going to go to Jessica Jordan first, and then we'll go to Jim Kaufman. So go right ahead, Jessica. We'll pull you up.
Thank you. Hi, General McMaster. First of all, thank you for sharing your insights with us today and for fielding our questions as well. I am a UNC Chapel Hill alumna. I actually met you at a conference at Carolina 10 years ago. You very graciously fielded my questions at the time and wrote me some notes during one of the sessions. So I wanted to say thank you. And then to pivot to my question, incidentally, 2 years after that conference, so back in 2012, I spent 3 months in Kabul at ISAF headquarters working with Shafafiyat, the counter-corruption task force you stood up. Afghanistan is never far from my mind. So my question to you tonight is, how do we define success in or for Afghanistan? Thank you.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Jessica. I really think we have misframed and we fundamentally misunderstand, the situation in Afghanistan, and I think the narrative is wrong about it. Of course, what we want to achieve is we want to ensure that terrorist organizations never again enjoy a safe haven and support base that allows them to commit mass murder attacks against us or our allies and others abroad. But I think that to do that, right, you need a viable Afghan state that can bear the brunt of that fight, right? We're not going to maintain over 100,000 troops in Afghanistan. We can't sustain that commitment over time. But what we can do is support our Afghan partners. I think it's important to understand that this year 10 of our courageous soldiers gave their lives defending all of us from jihadist terrorist organizations that pose a threat to all civilized people. But to recognize that 30 Afghans a day give their lives, soldiers and policemen, to maintain the freedoms that their country has enjoyed since 2001. I think that's worth getting behind. I think the narrative has been one of defeat, on our side. When I think, what if we just change that? What if we won already? And we just say that we've won and Afghanistan is not going to be Denmark. It doesn't need to be Denmark. It's going to be a place where there's violence, but our objective is not to eliminate all violence in Afghanistan. But our objective is to deny the safe haven support base. And I think what we would want to accomplish there are really four objectives that would allow us to accomplish that overall goal. The first is internal political accommodation among Afghanistan's factions based on a shared vision for the country. I think that's feasible and doable if we orient our diplomatic efforts on that. I think it's natural that it happens. Afghanistan's never been a centralized, tightly unified state, but it doesn't have to be, right? It just needs to be Afghanistan. The second aspect of it is that Afghan state has to be hardened or strengthened against the regenerative capacity of the Taliban, which lies across the border in Pakistan. And so that's strengthening state institutions, functions, counter-corruption and reform is a big part of that effort. Security forces are ahead, I think, in gaining that kind of strength, but it requires a sustained commitment. The third aspect of this effort would be to convince regional actors to play a more productive or a less destructive role. This is Pakistan in particular, and I think we ought to ensure that Pakistan knows that if it continues to support these groups as it is today, that it will suffer the consequences, and its future kind of looks like the future, looks like North Korea today, a pariah state with a single state sponsor of China. If China even continues to support a Pakistani state that supports these terrorist organizations, and finally sustained international support, and we could share the burden. I think it's all feasible. Sadly, the Trump administration has taken this abhorrent approach of actually partnering with the Taliban against the Afghan government. I think it is going to be a humanitarian catastrophe of colossal scale, unless it's reversed, by a Biden administration. But sadly, I think what the Trump administration has done is they have replicated and actually magnified the flaws in the Obama administration's approach to Afghanistan. So I hope that a Biden administration comes in with a clear-eyed view, doesn't try to turn the clock back to 2016, and tries to rectify these fundamental flaws. I think President Trump, with these personnel moves he just made, is trying to accelerate the withdrawal of every single U.S. soldier out of Afghanistan. And this is a reflection of, of the, kind of the, you could call it the Tucker Carlson or Rand Paul, wing of the Republican Party that sees our disengagement there as an unmitigated good. Thank you, and thanks for your service in Afghanistan, and go Tar Heels.
Okay, so now we're going to go to Jim Kaufman, former World Boston board chair. Hi, Jim, go ahead.
Thanks, Mary. And thank you, General McMaster, for joining us this evening. Much appreciated. In a recent interview, you gave advice to President-elect Biden not to re-enter the JCPOA, the deal with Iran. And I think in that meeting you said, referring to the deal, that Iran applied the money they received to intensify sectarian violence across the region in an effort to put a proxy army on the border of Israel. It would be a really big mistake to turn the clock back to 2016 and resurrect the nuclear deal. I'm extremely sympathetic to that perspective. However, Iran remains a significant threat in the region with its expansionist philosophy and actions. Do you have advice for President-elect Biden as to how to contain Iran?
Right. Well, James, I cover this in detail, in Battlegrounds, and I'll tell you, I think that we have to keep two crucial elements of two considerations at the forefront of any kind of strategy or policy designed for Iran. The first of these is we can't develop a policy or strategy that's disconnected from the very nature of the regime, right? I mean, you can't. First of all, you can't trust these guys because they are, they are pursuing this revolutionary ideology that defines us as the great Satan, that defines Israel as the little Satan, and that is aimed at reestablishing, influence, across the Middle East. And by doing so, this is kind of what they call forward defense, after the 80 to 88 war. But it's really a forward offense in which they are attempting to keep the Arab world perpetually weak, and to keep the Arab world perpetually weak by keeping it enmeshed in conflict, in this destructive sectarian civil war you see across the region, and to keep it weak by applying the Hezbollah model broadly to the region, where they have, a weak government in power that's beholden to or dependent on Iran for support, while they create militias and other illegal armed groups that lay outside that government's control that can be turned against that government if it acts against Iranian interests. This is, of course, applies to Lebanon. Obviously, it applies to what they're trying to do in Iraq, in Syria with the Assad regime, and what they would like to see in Yemen as well. And so I think what we have to do is try to constrain the resources available to that regime, so that they don't have the resources to continue this 4-decade-long proxy war against us. And the second element of the policy is to recognize, right, that you can't isolate, an approach toward the nuclear and missile program, from this 4-decade-long proxy war. And we need an approach that connects the two. Because if, for example, you offer sanctions relief and the big payoffs that they got up front, those profits from that, the economic benefits of that, are going to go right to the RGC and go right to the proxy war against us. We know that happened. I have the statistics, in Battlegrounds, and so I think I think what we have to have is a goal to try to influence a shift in the nature of the Iranian regime such that it ceases its permanent hostility to us. And that doesn't mean like a 2003 regime change, but it means don't engage in policies that actually strengthen the regime. And that's what the JCPOA did. Because guess who the beneficial owners are of the companies that were benefiting from these letters of agreement and contracts? It's the leadership of the RGC, it's the Supreme Leader and the Guardian Council and the clerical order that is perpetuating violence and makes Iran the greatest state sponsor of terrorism in the world. So hey, that would be my advice is to keep those two considerations in mind.
Thank you.
So now we're going to Autumn. Go right ahead, Autumn.
Hi. Well, thank you so much, General McMaster, for being here and doing this. I'm a current graduate student at Northeastern, so this is all right along the lines of what I've been studying, so that's really cool. My question is, I saw in a recent interview that you did that you said the US shouldn't be worried about Trump clinging to power, and I specifically am not, that worried, but I know a lot of people who are. What do you say to those people about why they really shouldn't be worried about him clinging to power, why that is, what are the protections in place? And then are there any ramifications you think from him delegitimizing this process and this election as a whole, especially in terms of our ability to promote democracy globally?
Yeah.
Great.
Hey, thanks, Autumn. Hey, I think I think we ought to take an opportunity to celebrate our democracy, right now. I mean, we had record numbers of people voting. I mean, I know there are a lot of people are saying, hey, we're hopelessly divided. My friend George Packer, is a brilliant writer. He's very concerned about it. But you know what? I mean, if we weren't divided, we'd be like a single party, right? Like we'd be like the Chinese, the Chinese or something. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party. I think it's okay to be divided as long as we have respectful, civil discussions about our differences. And then as I argue in Battlegrounds, we have to talk first about like what we do agree on as a basis for, for improving our nation. That's what we have to get to. And what we also have to do is have confidence, as you're alluding to, in our democratic institutions and processes. And whereas this is a long drawn out process, right? I mean, the Republican Party is and the Trump campaign are initiating all these lawsuits. I think that's okay. All right, do that. And this is in some ways analogous to towards the George W. Bush Gore, Vice President Gore campaign and election results. But what I think is disappointing, I think should be unacceptable, is the president drawing into question the sanctity of our election process and doing so with these specious claims of fraud. Hey, there's probably some voter fraud out there, but it's not significant, right? And we know that we've done a lot of important work to protect our votes and our election process. A lot of that important work to secure it's been done under the Trump administration, right? This is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Organization and the changes to our cyber policy so we can be more effective at defending our systems. I mean, all of these 54 different electoral processes have been meeting federal standards now. So I do think that this is a problem, and we ought to kind of try to drown it out, to say, okay, let's not accept, these kind of false claims and restore the confidence in our democratic processes. Autumn, what was the first part of your question again? I'm sorry, that was the second part of your question.
Just if you think everything that's been going on with delegitimizing it is going to hurt our ability to promote democracy globally going forward.
I don't think so. I don't think it should, right? And I think whenever you engage with, like I do frequently, foreign partners. I'm going to have a conversation here in a little while with Julie Bishop from Australia, who was the former foreign minister there. And in our last conversation, she was concerned about, hey, don't be concerned. It was a vibrant, political process and democratic process. And we'll get through it. I do think we ought to make a concerted effort, though, to addressing what we've seen as these divisions in our society in particular. I think that the Biden administration should come up with a program that is entitled equality of opportunity, for example, to ensure that Americans understand that that their chances of participating in the American dream are not limited based on what zip code they're born in. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done, but what I hope is that the message will be that we can make America better. We've never been perfect. Our founders believed that our republic would require constant nurturing. That was true at the beginning. That's true now. And I do think that we should have confidence in the transition. That was the first part of the question. Sorry. Hey, the executive has no role in the transition, is what I would say. Our founders were pretty smart about this. They had lived through the English Civil War, the bloody wars of the 17th century in England, and they set it up. So, I mean, President Trump or any president has no say in the transition. The voters have a say. The Electoral College has a say. If that doesn't do it, the Congress has a say. If it needs to be adjudicated, it's our judicial system. And I believe that any of these challenges to the vote counts, I think they'll all be dealt with at the state level. The Supreme Court probably won't even need to get involved. So I'm not worried about it. I don't think we should be worried about it, Autumn. Thanks.
Okay, and then we'll go to Irv. Go right ahead, Irv.
Hey, let me unmute myself. Can you hear me?
Yep, another wonderful World Boston board member.
Hi, General. I just purchased your book and I'm heading to Florida for 5 weeks and I can't wait to read it.
All right, thanks, Irv. I appreciate that.
Okay. My question is, I've been confused lately by the nature of our relationship with NATO, Russia's pursuit of control over energy, and the fact that one of our chief NATO partners, Germany, is signing a deal to be supplied gas and oil by the guy we're supposed to be defending them from. Sort of putting their head in the vice, so to speak. So I'd like you to sort of unwind that for me and let me know why NATO still is important and what is Germany trying to accomplish with this.
Yeah. Hey, hey, thanks, Irv. I mean, it doesn't make sense to me either, Irv. I mean, I think it's terrible that Germany is giving Vladimir Putin coercive power over their economy and energy supply. And actually, as they're doing that, they're also undercutting Ukraine by providing this alternative method of distribution of natural gas that will eliminate transit fees potentially, even though they pledged not to do so. I don't believe them, obviously. So I think that this is a travesty, and it's kind of compounded by the fact that Germany has not met the Wales pledge of spending 2% of their GDP on defense. They're spending actually less than 1%. And our European deterrence initiative, just the additional cost of the European deterrence initiative, is a rotation of U.S. forces over into Europe. The cost of that to U.S. taxpayers equated to about 33% of Germany's defense budget, right? So come on. So I think we need to have continued conversation about burden sharing. I don't believe that the way that our ambassador there went about it, I don't believe the way President Trump went about it was necessarily productive. But I actually in some ways made it harder for Chancellor Merkel and the CDU to increase defense spending in some ways. But Germany has a lot to sort out on their own. They have to get their people to understand the need to spend more on defense, and we ought to encourage them to do that. Certainly, NATO is still important, I think, because of the burden sharing, and also for the need for NATO to adapt to new arenas of competition. This is what I describe in the book as Russian new generation warfare, and particularly Russia's efforts to accomplish its political objectives below the threshold that might elicit a concerted NATO military response. And so we have to get better, at competitions in cyberspace, as well as coping with cyber-enabled information warfare against us and various forms of political subversion. And then also we have the threat from jihadist terrorist organizations that is immensely important for us to work on together, right? I mean, what should concern all of us is I think these jihadist terrorist organizations are more potent today in many ways than they were on September 10th, 2001. the Al Qaeda and ISIS alumni, the Al Nusra alumni, the Lashkar-e-Taiba alumni, they're orders of magnitude larger than the Mujahideen alumni of the resistance to Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, those who committed mass murder against us on September 11th. They're much more mobile, and they've moved into Europe, a lot of these alumni. And guess what? We don't require visas for travel from Europe. So we have an interconnected security issue that's mainly law enforcement and intelligence, but I think the NATO format for that is important to maintain. And then we have NATO also has to cope with other threats from the south associated with the refugee crisis, and I think NATO is an important ally, an alliance for coping with various forms of Chinese aggression, and in particular, China's sustained campaign of industrial espionage against us to gain a differential defense advantage. So I think the NATO alliance can help us with other competitions beyond deterring a conventional, or God forbid, a nuclear confrontation with Russia. I think we have to evolve the organization beyond that. I do think that Stoltenberg has been good on this, the Secretary General, on the reform of NATO. But it's a big format. It was 26 countries now, I think 26. But it's tough and we have Turkey that's not a really reliable partner member anymore. So I mean, what did Churchill say? The only thing worse than than working with allies or going to war with allies is going to war or going without them, right? So it's not going to be a perfect picture, but it's worth investing our efforts into, I think, Irv.
So it sounds like the mission needs to be readdressed.
Yeah, I think so. And of course, that's going to require the political arm of NATO to become more relevant and effective, right? Because a lot of these decisions, I mean, they're not military decisions, right? They're more political decisions.
So we have time for one last lightning question from David. David, we're going to pull you up. Go right ahead.
Yes, I can.
Just coming back briefly to your comment on Iran, the case you make for the interconnection of the nuclear and the non-nuclear threat is a strong one. But the flip side question is, what is a plausible deterrent strategy for an already de facto nuclear capable Iran? If we're not going back to the deal, what is it that we are going to do to actually prevent the development of an Iranian nuclear weapon? I'm just not clear.
Great, thank you.
Okay, well, it's not clear that the deal would do it either, right? And one of the flaws of the deal was the fact that the inspection verification mechanisms were inadequate, right? I mean, before the ink was even dry on the deal, Iran was listing off all the sites that we couldn't inspect, for example, David. So I think that what we have available is what we had available, back in 2008. I think in many ways we've turned the clock back to 2008 and 2009, and I think we ought to do whatever is within our authorities to do to disrupt or block their path toward these kind of capabilities. I think at some stage, we're going to have to play for not to, make the same assumptions we made about North Korea, like that the regime can't survive, but I do think we ought to not give them additional resources to apply to this program or to apply to the proxy war. And what the title of the chapter I have on Iran is forcing a choice, right? Iran has not had to make that choice between either acting as a responsible nation state or being treated like a sponsor of terrorist organizations that it is. And I think if we did work together, across the free world with European allies in particular, that we could put a great deal of more pressure on the regime. And I think it's that kind of pressure that might convince the Iranian people that they want something different from their government. Now, I mean, none of this is guaranteed successful, and I think it still remains to be seen how the Israelis will look at this, right? I mean, the Begin doctrine is something to which the Israelis have adhered to. I don't think that would certainly change under Netanyahu. Actually, he's in his previous prime ministership authorized strikes against nuclear facilities. I mean, I think it's a real possibility if we continue to see the news like we did in the last 24 hours of enrichment beyond the levels agreed to in the JCPOA and so forth. So, David, it's a dangerous time for sure. There's not a clearly good option to block all paths, but I do think the best course is to force them to make a choice. And we have to do that, I think, with like-minded partners. Thank you.
Okay, so I think unfortunately we don't have time for any more questions, but I'll hand it back to Jeff.
Okay. To the audience, I want to say that this is who we are. This is what World Boston does to further public discussion on vital foreign policy issues facing the United States. And so that I ask you to join us and to support us. And to General McMaster, I want to thank you for participating in this conversation. Your keen mind and courageous spirit really came through. And I believe that you've convinced me, well, you convinced me when I read the book, but you further convinced me that you are a vital resource to an administration, any administration. And I look forward to hearing more from you in the future.
Thanks, Jeff. I appreciate it. Thanks to all of you. What a pleasure to be with you. And thanks for the great work that you do at World Boston. And
thank you.
In the conclusion of the book, I say that, hey, the greatest source of strength for a nation is an educated populace. And what World Boston does is help us inform each other about the challenges we face. And so it's been a real privilege to be with you. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Mary. Thanks, Elise, and the whole team.
Yes.
Thanks, everyone.